Okay, great. So thank you everybody for coming along to our Empty Homes network event for communities creating homes. I wanted to start by introducing Sarah Williams, who's part of the housing team at Ceredigion County Council, who's going to be giving us a run through of the legal aspects of empty homes in relationship with county councils or local authorities, actually, I should say. Thank you, Sarah. If you'd like to share your screen, that'd be fantastic.
Thanks. And can I just check you can hear me okay, Alan?
Yes, we can. Thank you. Great.
Oh, that's totally the wrong screen there, isn't it? Share screen. Let's have a look. Application window. Right. Let's see.
It should come up as your PowerPoint.
I have to press start. Can you see that now?
Yes.
Yeah, is that okay?
You can see the whole PowerPoint presentation at the moment.
That's great. I'll just make a start then, shall I?
What I mean to say by that is that it hasn't gone from the beginning. It's the whole thing.
Oh, right. Okay. Yeah. So I'll try and start it again from the beginning. Is that popped in as just a screen? If I click the next slide, is that any better?
No. Okay. I think what you might have to do is come out of that briefly. If you stop sharing, and then in your PowerPoint presentation, go to share options. Sorry, I need to check.
I think I can put it as the whole screen anyway. If I share the whole screen, share my entire screen instead. I press.
Okay, try that.
Slideshow from the beginning. I lose you. Let's go back in there. Is that any better now?
That's good. Yeah.
Okay, great. All right, we'll go with that then. So yeah, welcome everybody. My name is Sarah Williams, and until very recently, I was the Empty Properties and Housing Standards Officer in Ceredigion County Council. I'm still in Ceredigion County Council, but I've just moved roles fairly recently. So I'm just going to take you through how local authorities deal with empty properties, basically. Okay, so to start with then, what is an empty dwelling? So from a local authority perspective, we are constrained with what we call an empty property in terms of what we need to report back to Welsh Government for our statistics. So what that includes for us is a dwelling that is liable for council tax. So that does exclude in our numbers anything that is derelict and not currently liable for council tax. We only count the empty properties that have been empty for over 6 months. We don't count the second homes properties in there. So we've got about just over 1,000 empty properties, but we've got a further 1,600 second homes in Ceredigion as well. So those are not counted in our stats back to Wales. The property has to be unfurnished, otherwise it goes into a different category. And in terms of the ones that we count, we exclude anything which is a social landlord, if it's council owned, if the Crown owns it, or the church or the police, NHS, those sorts of government bodies are excluded. And the reason for that is really that the council doesn't have a lot of, we do have some powers, but we wouldn't really be chasing those ones down to bring them back into use. So we would be reliant on those government agencies doing that for their own properties. And so because we wouldn't be taking any action on any of them, we don't include them in our figures. Usually those properties are not empty too long, and they sort of go round in the circle fairly quickly. For your purposes, as communities looking for empty dwellings, clearly you could be using other buildings for, bringing your projects forwards, and the council might or might not include that in their empty figures. But for your purposes, I guess it's kind of irrelevant. Just a bit of data from Ceredigion. As I say, last year, so this was from 2019, we had 1,057 empty dwellings on our list. But we have a natural turnover of about 500. So when we only count once a year. And once we come to the end of the year and we look at the new list, the next year you find around 500 have dropped off, but at the same time 500 new ones have come back on again. So I just wanted to show you the little pie chart there of the sort of timescales that these empty properties have been empty for. And you can see that nearly half of them are less than 2 years empty. So you would assume that those ones are in fairly good condition. A lot of them are, you know, somebody's died there, they're in probate, or they're renovating them, or they're for sale, and those kinds of things. So again, in terms of council action, we wouldn't necessarily be targeting anything that we think is sort of transactional, in that it's moving on of its own accord, really. So, you know, another just over a quarter are between 2 and 5 years empty. So, you know, 3/4 of our empty dwellings are less than 5 years been empty. And then we've just got those smaller segments there where they're a bit more long-standing empty homes, and can be the troublesome ones. It's difficult to say. So some of those that have been empty for a very long time are in very rural locations, and you wouldn't even know they were there. They're down farm tracks and things like that. So again, that's not something that we would be targeting, particularly as a local authority, because they're not causing anybody any trouble, and people don't really want to access them anyway. But then obviously you get others then which, you know, might be next door to somebody that's causing trouble, and you know, dilapidated, or there's pests there and that kind of thing. So those would probably be the ones that we would be targeting. I've just got this slide now from somewhere else, so this isn't our figures, but just so that you can see some of the reasons why a property might be empty. And a lot of them, the biggest reasons down the bottom there is repair and renovation and sale. So, you know, people are in the process of bringing it back into use, or, you know, sometimes they get a bit stalled, so they start with renovating, then they run out of money, or they get some health problems or that kind of thing, change jobs, and so they sort of stall in the renovation and they can't really sort of move further. But there is a wide range of reasons why empty properties are empty, and that in itself causes complications with how you're trying to deal with an empty, because every situation is slightly different. So I wanted to touch on the empty property premium. I don't know if you've heard about this before, but in Wales, we are able to charge an extra council tax on anything which is empty or is a second home. And we've been able to do this since, well, 2014, the legislation came in, 2015, we were able to enact it, but then we had to give 12 months notice as well. So in Ceredigion, at the moment, we charge an extra 25% of council tax on empty homes and on our second homes. And the reason for doing that is just to try and, it's more of the stick approach to push people into getting them back into use. You know, so it's costing them to stay empty, so they should be turning them around and bringing them back into homes for people. And this does vary across Wales. So some councils are not charging anything at all extra, and then some other councils are charging 100% extra. So basically you have to pay double the council tax. So Swansea have been doing that for their certainly their second homes. I'm not sure about their empties. And Gwynedd, I noticed in the last week, has just brought that forwards, that they're going to be starting to charge an extra 100% for their second homes in Gwynedd, because obviously they've got quite a lot of holiday home problems there. And then just to show you how many of them would be charged this premium. So again, this is to do with Ceredigion, but you probably find it similar across the rest of Wales, really. Only 58% of our empty dwellings are charged the extra 25%. And that's because the other ones fall into different categories. So if, number one, if they're less than 12 months empty, they don't get charged any extra. They just get charged the regular council tax. And then also, if they're undergoing renovation, they get a bit of an exemption. If they're for sale, they get a bit of an exemption. If it's a probate scenario, so somebody's died, they don't have to pay it. So I think what we've certainly found with the empty property premium is that it hasn't really been that much of incentive. So whether it's because we only charge 25% and we should increase it, it hasn't really made a difference to our figures at all in terms of the numbers that are coming back into use. I don't know if you're aware, but Welsh Government in 2019 held an inquiry into empty property. So I thought I would just mention that. And they found that there's 27,000 empty homes in Wales. And what they were often finding is a lack of strategic corporate approach within councils then. So yes, they might have an empty property or a housing department that deals with empty properties, but there wasn't really the buy-in from estates, from legal services, from council tax and the higher management to drive bringing the use of empty properties forwards. And we certainly found that in Ceredigion as well. And so some of the recommendations which they came out with, so there was about 12 or 15 recommendations, but I just picked up a couple to show you here, is that local authorities form a local action plan for empty properties, and this will feed into a national action plan. And this has been hampered by COVID this year, unfortunately. So there was a big driver at the beginning of the year, and then COVID has kind of got in the way and the plans have kind of slipped a little bit. They want to improve, so the Welsh Government are pushing us to improve partner working and for community-based approaches. And certainly in Ceredigion, we would be keen to be working with a community that had a project that they wanted to move forwards. I think, the difficulty that we think from our perspective is that has to come from the community. So obviously we can't make a community decide to do something. Somebody has to come to us then and say, we're thinking about this project and could you help us to make it work? They also want to review the current enforcement powers. So I am going to touch on those a little bit later with you, just so you've got some idea of what we can and can't do. And they wanted to undertake corporate training across departments. So that has happened this year. So they employed a consultant to deliver the training to local authorities up and down Wales. And we held a few sessions with them. They were all virtual, but obviously we're getting used to that now in this post-COVID world, aren't we? And we had legal services come and estates come and finance come, the councillors came and that. So we delivered some of these training sessions. On the back of that, we're supposed to do this action plan, but that hasn't made that step forward. And partly that's perhaps due to the fact that now I've moved post and I haven't been replaced yet. So how can you find an empty dwelling? Well, for starters, we won't share our full empty property list. So this is one of those GDPR things. But we don't give out a full list of empty properties in our area, and you'll find that with all the councils, I think. I think there was a case on it once, which has obviously made us all a bit twitchy. I mean, you can have a look in estate agents and auctioneers to see the ones which are actually up and marketed for sale. That's always a good way. Word of mouth is useful and driving by. So, if you find a property and you think, oh, that looks vacant and looks useful for us, suit our purposes, and we might want to take something forwards, you can come to us as a council and we might be able to confirm if it's empty or not. And the other thing that I certainly did when I was in post was I was happy to, if I had the detail, approach the owner and send them a letter and say, look, we think you've got an empty property and we would like to help you bring it back into use. And actually somebody's approached us and they would be interested in selling. And if you want to get in touch with that person, then here are their details. So I was always happy to do that. I don't know that it was ever any success, but it's worth an ask, I guess. If you find an empty property and you want to find the owner's details, so we wouldn't give the owner's details out to you, but you can, for a fee, get the title from Land Registry. So I think it costs about £12 and you can get the title to any place. But what you might find is some of them are unregistered still, even though it's 1985 or something that Land Registry came in as compulsory registration. If they're in the same ownership from before then, they can still be unregistered dwellings. And the other thing which you might find is that the ownership, so you might see that it's owned by Mr. and Mrs. Williams, but it's owned by them living at that property, so it won't give you an address. Sometimes you'll find it's owned by Mr. and Mrs. Williams, they live in Cardiff, and you'll have a lead then in which you might be able to follow. So anybody can get that information from Land Registry if it's registered. And also it's probably worth an ask to local authorities, to the estates department, to see if they've got some vacant units which they're looking to do something with or move on or in collaboratively. And so often councils have developed new offices and moved out of smaller pokey offices, and they're wondering what to do with those kinds of dwellings. It's always worth asking, I think. Estate departments would be the best bet there. So what finance can we offer? Well, Welsh Government have provided various funding pots to local authorities to try and bring empty properties back into use. And that can be via town centre regeneration money, So there's quite a focus on town centres at the moment, and so some of the pots of money are ring fenced to certain towns. We do have empty property loans, that's across the whole of Wales, so that's up to £25,000 to bring an empty property back into use per unit. So if you're subdividing to flats, you could have multiple 25s. There are town centre loans, again they're ring fenced to town centres, and you might in some places be able to get grants. So certainly in South Wales they have a big grant programme going in the valleys. So yeah, I think the thing is, check out the housing and the business grants pages on the local authority pages to see what they've got available. So lastly, just to touch on enforcement on what councils can do when we have empty properties. Apologies if you can hear the noise, there's a big plane going by. We have got various legislation which we can tackle problem empty properties with. And really, we would only use those bits of legislation, or we can only use them if the property is causing a problem to other people. So if it's in disrepair and it's a safety issue, you know, if it's in disrepair and it's in the middle of nowhere in a field and there's not even a track up to it, we wouldn't do anything with it. But if there's a safety issue, if the slates are slipping off and there's a pavement out the front, then certainly we have got some bits of legislation to be able to tackle those things. If there's pests there, if it's a nuisance and those kinds of things. The caveat to that is that doesn't bring the empty property back into use. So, you know, if you've got a bit of disrepair and the chimney's falling down, we might tell them to take the chimney down, but that's the end of it. It's still empty at the end of the day. We do have the power to do an empty dwelling management order, and that would basically mean that we would take over the property for a period of up to 7 years and manage it ourselves. So that is very rarely used because there's a lot of paperwork to go along with it, but it is a possibility whereby if we think that the landlord is not doing anything and it's in fairly good order and we could make use of it as a housing service department, you know, then we could apply to the RPT to get an empty dwelling management order granted, and we would effectively become the landlord for that period. We would be able to claim our costs from the rent, but any excess rent then would go back to the landlord, and we wouldn't have the powers to sell it or anything. We can do an enforced sale if we've got debt on the property. So sometimes this can be used in conjunction with the legislation. So we might, it works particularly well if we can't find the owner, if we don't know the owner, if they're deceased or they're away and what have you, because we could go to a property that's insecure, that the squatters were going in. We could board it up under a bit of legislation that we can do to stop anybody from using it anymore. That's obviously cost us some money. The money would go as a charge on the property. We ask for the money back, nobody gives it back because there isn't anybody to do so, and then we can use that debt to be able to sell the property at auction, which can move properties on. So that has been used with some success. And lastly, then we can do a compulsory purchase order, but again, this is usually quite unlikely. It's quite an unwieldy piece of kit. It requires the council putting money into their pockets to buy a property under a forced agreement with the owner, and that's a court order and all those kinds of things. I think mostly where we have to have a reason for doing it as well under the various different bits of legislation, so that you usually find that gets used when they need to do a new road development or a new town centre development and the properties are in the way. Certainly in Aberystwyth, when we had the new Tesco's come and they wanted to redevelop this area, they used a compulsory purchase order to buy a whole street of properties, of which most of them were occupied by people, but you know, could similarly be used on an empty dwelling. And that's pretty much it. I think that's probably my 10 minutes. So if anybody's got any questions now, I'll try and stop sharing my screen.
Brilliant, thanks Sarah, you covered a lot of ground there. That was really, really helpful. And we have got some questions in the chat. So I'll bring people in. Just going back, we had Matt Mitchell asked a question around, are second homes registered as businesses part of the stats?
The business ones are not. So the stats only include empty properties, but we also can do a number of, you know, how many second homes we've got, and Cabinet would be able to draw that number out for us. I don't think that isn't a stat which we have to regularly report on to Welsh Government, although sometimes we do get you know, freedom of information requests and things where we have to provide that number. So the ones which are registered as businesses wouldn't be those second homes then. So they are registered as businesses and they pay business rates and they don't pay council tax. So they wouldn't be included is the answer to the question. And then there are rules around which ones would fall into that category or not fall into that category.
Great, thank you. And Dave Palmer was asking, are properties empty for longer now during COVID due to legal probate and builder construction delays?
I couldn't say at the moment because it's too soon. We usually get the figures once a year, so we sort of collect them in March, ready for the April New Year. So I think what I'd have to do is have a look at what our figures are going to be this March and compare them with others and have the previous year and the previous year to see if they were empty or not. I think it's probably quite likely. Certainly, I'm finding in my day-to-day that things are slower to happen because of difficulties with COVID and having to homework and getting the actual paperwork, and legal services often want the paper which has been signed by a pen rather than an electronic signature and that kind of thing. Land Registry are certainly well behind with their workload at the moment, and they're very slow, so it's probably likely.
Brilliant, thanks, Sarah. There's a question from Evelyn asking, do LA local authority empty property departments work with local authority housing departments when planning for housing need and demand?
It would be really nice to say that local authorities have an empty property department. Wouldn't that be great? I think what you'll find is there might be one person dealing with empty properties. Certainly in Ceredigion, it was only part of my role. So I basically did 1 day a week on empty properties. It is an underfunded position. It hasn't really been given much in the way of kudos to have an empty property officer. There's a couple of local authorities that have 2. Lots have 1 and some have none. And generally, the position is either in the housing section or the estates department. But those empty property officers, where they exist, will work with planning, with estates, with housing, with council tax, and all of those departments to try and bring projects forward. So they tend to be sort of project specific then. So they'll work with an empty dwelling, whatever that empty dwelling needs to move it on, they will assist with.
Do you have any examples of communities working with Ceredigion County Council to bring an empty home back into use?
Sadly not, no. So I don't know if they've done it without, if there has been any that have happened without local authority involvement. But certainly if we had had local authority helping a community to take something forwards, I would have known about it in the last few years. So I'm not aware of anything, but we are keen to work with a community that wants to do that and see where we can assist. But as I said at the beginning, it relies on the community thinking, right, we want to take a project forwards, let's try and ask the local authority for some assistance. We can't find a property and just say, can you do something with it, community, and we'll help you, because the drive has got to be with the community, really, or the community group.
Brilliant. Brilliant. Thank you so much, Sarah, for coming and speaking to us today. It's really helpful. And if you'd like to stay for more of the meeting, that'd be great. And now I'll introduce Chris Laughton, if you are there and ready to speak.
Unmuted.
Unmuted.
That's a start, isn't it? And then we're going to share a screen, I believe.
That's it.
Let's try that. Share a PowerPoint. Oh, how's that?
Looking good.
Tile screen. Radio. Okay, we'll go. Alan, thank you. I shall take it away. Yeah, we've got Biggles flying the tornadoes over the Dubby Valley today, possibly over a few of the presenters. It only takes them a few minutes, doesn't it, to buzz around Wales. So I'm sorry about that, but well, I'll maybe pause when they do actually do a dance over Machynlleth, which is where I am speaking to you from, and so quite surprisingly dry and bright, I should tell you today. Right, let's talk about empty homes in West Wales and why indeed are they empty? And that was a slide that came up before, didn't it, with the previous presenter? And I was looking at that slide, and I thought it was interesting. It was mentioning, referring to notes, the renovate and repair was definitely mentioned, wasn't it? But what was not mentioned specifically was heating and ventilation. which is pretty much what I'm just going to talk about today. Very, very briefly, of course, because it's a big subject. But in my experience as a heating engineer, that if you're not comfortable, it just starts eating away at you, and eventually you start wanting to change the situation. And if you can't change it in the house you're in, you start thinking about leaving. That's pretty fundamental movement in people. So comfort is important, and heating and ventilation is quite an important part of that. Not all of it, of course, but certainly something that can often be addressed by owners of houses. So that's why we're talking about it. So let's just sort of have a little look here with, hopefully, whoa, why won't that move? Alan, you're the expert here. How can I get that slide to move? There we go.
Yeah, there we go. Okay,
sorry, it's my sticky laptop key, possibly. That slide, nice and colourful, isn't it? Which is why I'm used it, really, is from actually care of Tadu, private online sort of thermostat service, as it were. And they've got these thermostats all over Europe. You just noticed at the bottom there, it says 80,000 European homes, sort of their data set there. I'll be frank with you, I'm one of them. I've got it. There are choices, by the way. I'm not saying this is the only choice to have an online thermostat, but it came to my attention was because they sent me an email, as you do. Actually, these online smart thermostats kind of quite interesting for people sort of managing homes, because there comes a fundamental issue is that a lot of people don't understand their thermostats, don't understand how to control the services in their home, and that can be one of the reasons they want to leave. They just simply don't understand the controls. So sometimes you try and simplify the controls. Sometimes people are tempted to make them tamper-proof, and that you now get into legal stuff here. It gets all complicated. Whether you can actually stop someone adjusting the thermostat. Would you believe that there is a restraint on that in some situations? But you could even just take it out of their hands and manage the temperature and ventilation centrally. That's, I think, an interesting way forward for people, given that many people don't understand how to control and stay comfortable. Of course, it runs you right into data protection issues. My view is get your lawyers involved. You can draw up contracts. Clearly, Tadu sorted that out. We're presenting anonymous statistics here from them. Effectively, I'm part of the statistics you see there in the red colour. I didn't colour the map, by the way. I know it should include Northern Ireland. I must tell Tadu, German company, by the way, that Northern Ireland is controversially still hanging in there as part of the UK. So really, it should have been coloured red, shouldn't it? Never mind. There's a little statistic down there at the bottom. Less than 2% of UK homes have top energy ratings. Yeah, so 1 in 50 homes is only at the top. That means, you know, there's 49 out of 50 homes that are like could be improved, right? So we can definitely make progress on this very subject. So 3 degrees there for United Kingdom, over 5 hours, with a temperature 20 degrees inside, whereas it might be 0 Celsius outside. So the whole of that chart has been normalized for that situation. Now, most people only kind of detect about 1 degree, 1.5 degrees change before they do something about it. So if you were in Norway, you can see 0.9 for 5 hours. They might not bother to go and change anything. But in the UK, we got 3 degrees change after 5 hours as an average. So many people will be looking for the thermostat and trying to work it out. And there comes all kinds of other issues, of course, once that happens. So anyway, that sort of indicates the UK's got a bit of an issue. I think you'd agree. Tadu will say that lots of people in the UK are using these smart thermostats. There is a sort of fee to use them, by the way. So it's not the cheapest way to use a thermostat in some ways, but over time, actually, they've got a lot of really interesting features, like they detect open windows, they have a weather function, lots of things I think are quite interesting. So do consider it for your situation. So moving on now to Wales and bringing in fuel poverty, which is a kind of interesting alignment to empty homes, I believe. These are Welsh government figures. You can see the reference at the bottom of the slide. The government figures did say the word estimate, so I am repeating that word. So looking at that chart there, on the left side of the scale, y-axis got numbers of fuel poor households, and then you got this light blue line, which is represented on the right-hand y-axis as a percentage, and then all the administrative areas of Wales lined up, and they're lined up left to right there according to that fuel poor, fuel poverty line. So you could argue it's a walk of shame for Gwynedd, Ceredigion, Paris, and Ynys Môn, if you care to, but I would not rush to do that, because you might also immediately say, and I'm sure that relevant officers in the councils would immediately point out, this is also effectively a reflection of population density. So, rural areas off the natural gas main are going to quite likely have higher fuel costs, and fuel poverty is not just related to fuel cost, it is to do with income, because it is a percentage of income calculation and the cost of fuel, as much as, the quality of housing. Nevertheless, it's an issue, right? I mean, look at the percentage figure for, those couple of counties I mentioned, one of which I'm in. We're talking, 20% of households in fuel poverty. That's loads, right? I mean, that means you're just bumping into them all the time on the high street. So, I mean, I'm sure some people on this presentation would feel they're in that realm. So it's clearly an issue in Wales, and even I think in those that do have natural gas, which is generally one of the cheaper fuels, it's going to be a major issue. So what can we do about that? And indeed, what is the issue? So a few more key fuel poverty statistics there, and just UK is doing really badly, right? In respect of keeping us warm efficiently. We're just clearly way at the bottom there. And that 32,000, excess deaths in the December, March, I know that's pre-COVID figures, but these are fairly big numbers, right? These are the consequences of us not heating properties, I believe. I mean, it's a complex subject. I'm not going to say it's the only subject, but I think when we see such seasonality with excess deaths, you've got to start thinking, hang on, what's that? Is that just because the humidity changing, air temperature changing? Why is it that so we humans seem to suffer quite badly in those years? So we've got to reflect on our interior climates, I believe, with statistics like this, and that lower statistic there. Look at the focus we've been giving on some of these other subjects that are chief cause of mortality, and yet there's a clear statement being made there. Let me just remind myself. It was I'm going to tell you who made that statistic. Sorry, End Fuel Poverty. I found that statement website campaign group very useful to visit. By the way, we made this clear statement there that looking at the statistics, that coal homes, in their view, are a very significant cause of mortality. So we really could do with paying attention, I think, to it. Now here's the rub, right? Here's to me like this big conflict in the whole story. SAGE is your emergency advisory group to government, right? You probably heard it all in the news. And if anyone in the UK is not yet aware that there's strong advice on sort of way we act in not only outside homes but even in our homes, and there's a copy I've made on the graphics. So open windows to keep fresh air. Yeah, fine. I mean, keeping high ventilation is a key suggestion to keep down respiratory diseases, and the separation there and the 2 meters apart. But this surely conflicts with additional heat costs, or just suffering more with being cold. And don't forget the rest of the issues of having open windows, right? Noise, security. And there's Part L, the building regs, whether for new or refurbishment, really trying to put a focus on air tightness. Well, what's, air tightness and opening windows? Am I detecting, a conflict here? Possibly. I hope you agree there is. It's kind of, where do you go on this? And if you're a housing manager, I think you're going to have to put a line in the sand on where you stand on this subject. People are getting somewhat contradictory advice, and it's quite a deal to come up with an answer. I'm not saying I have all the answers either. I can give strong suggestions, not maybe part of this presentation, but separately it may be. But look at the consequences. It's not just mortality statistics, which are often hidden. This black mold is so common to find, and people are already confused by what causes it, and the fact that it keeps coming back. If you've come across it, you've scrubbed it off, you've maybe put bleach on it, you've possibly repainted it, and all of a sudden discovered, it comes back. It spores get in the air, but also in the plaster. You're basically on a loser with this, unless you're changing the fundamental conditions in this house. You're on for replastering that, or replasterboarding, lining out that room, probably dry lining while you do it. I mean, why not? But then you're losing dimensions of the room, and those people may well have to get out of the house while it's happening. It's a big, major issue. And it's all well and good to reoccupy a house, but if it's going to do that on you in a year's time, you've got a big problem. And I do believe we should be thinking about making the quality of our homes better in an informed way, so this situation does not keep occurring. So just in short, high humidity, poor ventilation, cold surfaces, there's your mold going to be growing. It's in ideal circumstance, typically behind a wardrobe, near a shower, or where you dry clothes on radiators. Very typical places you'll see this occurring. So last slide, you'll be pleased to know. What are we going to do about it? Well, there is this technical guides. Notice the number of pages there at the bottom, by the way, so you just understand that they're quite significant documents. These two work together. They are publicly available specifications. You can access them online. If you want it in a nutshell, there is no insulation without ventilation. If you're going to insulate, which is often your first instinct, don't forget the ventilation, and you will therefore have to deal with the actual sort of Part L of the building regs, pressure building up about, going airtight, and yet you've got to extract the excess moisture. And there lies, as I say earlier, the rub and the whole situation. So there is a way forward. There is an answer. These are management level documents. They've got a significant weight to them in their technical content, and they will be suggesting a change in your management lineup. Be aware of that. This is not just, it's not really just tick box culture here. We're talking about quite significant changes in the way you will be approaching empty homes once you take on board some suggestions in those documents. So thank you for listening to those thoughts. I'm pleased the jet stayed away while I was talking, and of course questions if you please. Over to you, Alan.
Oh, fantastic, Chris. So good to have your expertise in the room, and for all those issues. I think it's really very important to think about those things when you're thinking about empty homes. And we've got a few comments in the chat. Chris, if you'd like to stop sharing your screen, then we can maybe have a look at those. But I think possibly at this stage we're running a tiny bit late, so we might go on to Martin's presentation and then have the breakout rooms, because I know some people will have to go at 1, but it looks like they're mostly comments rather than questions. So if you're happy with that, Chris, we can come back to that afterwards.
Sure.
And I'll now introduce Martin.
Yep. Hello, good afternoon, everyone. No jets plan to come over the Humber today, and welcome to Empty Homes Week, which, a bit like Easter, seems to move around every year to a different month. I've been asked by Alan today to give a whistle-stop tour of our work here in Hull, our Empty Homes work. So I will endeavour to do that, and I've got quite a lot of slides to whiz through, maybe just to give us sort of quite a lot of pictures about the work we do, which maybe will be helpful. But before I do that, I've certainly been thinking how what we do here in Hull can help and relate to the work that's potentially going on in Wales. And I think certainly listening today to what Sarah was saying, I think the first thing I would say is about collaboration with the local authority. And I think Hull, whose council has many failings and has had many failings over the years, I think the work that they've done with the community groups in Hull to basically form a partnership is really impressive. And I would, suggest people maybe look at some of that work to see as how that can be a way of bringing together the local authorities. As Sarah said, if community groups don't come forward, the council can't do this on their own. That relationship has been really important to us in our work. I mean, obviously we work with Sarah's equivalent, I know Sarah's moved post now, in Hull, the empty property officer, to identify empty properties. We sometimes bring them to her attention, she sometimes brings them to our attention. We work with a local authority about contacting owners and starting negotiations, and that combination where the local authority can apply a bit of stick and then we can be there with a bit of carrot to help some of these people out of the situations they're in. Also, I think what's really important is you build that strategic approach, which I think is really important. I mean, what we do at Giroscope, we're like a neighbourhood regeneration scheme. So having that strategic approach to the neighbourhood where certain empty properties are causing real problems and looking at the bigger picture is really helpful. The other reason for working closely with your local authority, and again, I think Sarah alluded to this, is of course, they may have properties that they don't want anymore. The same goes for housing associations who are getting rid of lots of their properties. So there is opportunities there to maybe get in there and see about asset transfer, see if you can get these things for nothing, see if you can get them for a reduced price. The other thing I would quickly say before whizzing through these slides, and I will whiz through them, is I think sometimes empty homes is sometimes seen as a sort of unglamorous brother or sister of new build. But what I would say is empty homes, as well as empty homes work, as well as a really useful end in itself. Who can possibly argue with bringing unused empty properties back into use to house people? It's a no-brainer. But it's also a great way to get projects going. For example, and I'll come on to it, we've got a new build going on here. We've started building houses. It's taken us basically 6 years to get from making that decision to do homes work. You can get straight on and get straight into doing some work. It's cost effective and it's relatively simple. You don't need to involve, no offence to architects, surveyors, planners and all the other people who may be in the room. You can crack on with that work pretty quickly without the heavy costs and time delays that the professionals need, the need for professionals often brings. So I would recommend this as a way for people if they're thinking of maybe wanting to build some houses, or maybe they're looking to support a certain disadvantaged group of people in housing, that actually doing that through Empty Homes work is a really good and effective way to start. So to quickly go through these, knew that happened. Don't move like Chris's ones. What do we know?
Martin, there's an arrow just.
There we go.
Oh, you've got it. You've got it. Okay, cool.
Right. So very quickly, just a bit of context. We're obviously at the other side of the country to you. This is Hull, city of a population of about 250,000 people. In the top, well, in the bottom 5 of cities with high levels of deprivation, and a city that's really always looked across the water to Europe more than it has back to the UK. Was even a member of the Hanseatic League back in the day. The neighbourhood where we do our work was once the centre of one of the biggest trawling fleets in the country, if not the biggest, which obviously kind of came to a pretty sad end in the 70s, and that's when this area really started to sort of seriously go downhill, even before the kind of all the problems that we had in the 80s. So Giroscope's been around a long time, started by some sort of general layabouts and students and local folk back in the mid-80s, a time of quite a heavy-duty Conservative government and a lot of strife and discord in the country. We came in it with a lot of attitude, which I've noticed is reflected back at me in these photographs. And importantly, I think we were also risk tolerant. I think a lot of the world has become very risk adverse. I think we embraced risk tolerance. We tended to get on and do things, buying houses and doing things that kind of young people maybe are a lot more reticent to do these days. Organisations sort of slowly grew through the 80s into the 90s. The part of Hull we work in started to see abandonment, a lot of people leaving the city, a lot of people moving into these riding and surrounding countryside. And then we had what was the then Labour government scheme, Housing Market Renewal, or Pathfinder Gateway it was called in Hull, which was demolished to demolish a lot of these houses. That scheme came to a brutal end in 2010 when Labour lost power, leaving streets which were, as the street in the illustration shows, sort of left halfway between being ready for demolition and not quite decanted of all the people. This caused a big problem with empty homes on like a kind of grand scale in Hull. As I said, our approach is to work at a neighbourhood level. So we have the odd outlying property, but most of our properties are within one neighbourhood, and you can see the little red blobs there that actually down some of the little courts and terraces in Hull, that a lot of our properties are in very close proximity. That makes the whole organisation much easier to run, much easier to manage, and it also puts us kind of rooted in our community and in our neighbourhood. A typical Giroscope property, this was, well, it's actually 2 properties, 3 flats in each. This was bought by 6 investors from the south, because after we had the abandonment, what moved in was lots of buy-to-let investors from all over the country and all over the world. People from Hong Kong, from Ireland, sports people, people with money, people with very dirty money. This was a case where 6 investors had bought these 6 flats across 2 properties, had failed to get them done up. The property sat empty for approximately 12 years. All the investors fell out with each other. We had to negotiate with them all to buy all the flats. We eventually did that, and a couple of years later had it turned around, and now we've got it all let out. They would have lost money on that, and they were also being hit by the council tax premium that Sarah talked about. More just quickly looking at some more examples of our work, and you can see here how, again, this strategic approach with the local authorities, so they've done the photo on the right, you can see railings and walls and solid wall insulation on the property. That's where the council stepped up and done some facelifting on the properties. So when the empties get brought back into use and you get this facelifting, the 2 things together can really bring the neighbourhood round. The inside of that property, it was a fire damaged property. Another one here that have been empty for, I mean, this is at the extreme end of the work we do. This was been empty for about 15 years. The owner, who's again a buy-to-let investor, had died, leaving it to her son, who was a bit freaked out by all the letters they were getting from environmental health. This had big holes in the roof, so lots of damp and rain damage, and this now looks like this, and is a house to a young family. An unusual one for Giroscope, more modern property. This was a little block of 80s flats, which we did up and turned around, and we actually fitted considerable thickness of insulation relating back to Chris's talk, and air source heat pumps, which is seems to be going okay, underfloor heating. And that's the after on that one. Again, here we see where the local authority's been involved in doing the facelift. In all these properties, Victorian terraced houses now all have solid wall insulation on them, brick slips at the bottom, which has considerably improved their performance in terms of heat loss. Interestingly, the young girl on the bike approached us for housing last week. She's now an 18-year-old and carrying a baby. So that's, again, how we are known in our community. People know where to come when they need housing. We also work with a lot of volunteers, a lot of disadvantaged people, a lot of ex-offenders. People come here and get work experience on the building projects before going off to employment. We have Les here who came as a volunteer and then became employed by us and has now left and is a self-employed plumber and a plumber we use. Danny went off and became a plasterer. We do a lot of work with refugees. Anas here on the right is a Syrian refugee, an electrician. He came over on about 10% of our housing is let to refugees. He came over and we were able to give him some work experience as well. And he ended up doing quite a lot of work with our electrician, very capable guy. Just some more pictures here of our volunteers. Our tenants, Giroscope Housing, open to everyone. So we house a wide range of people. About a quarter of those people we receive enhanced housing benefit for, so we get some additional support. And we ask them to smile in the photographs. Dimitru here from Romania. Hull has a very large population of people that have come from the Ascension states in Eastern Europe, a lot of Romanian, Bulgarian and Polish people. Just a very quick look at how we pay for all this. Most of it is paid for by lending money off the banks, which is secured finance. We get that at a very, obviously at the moment, very low interest rate. It's 30-year borrowing. We also work with a social investor, Social and Sustainable Capital, who help us with the risk element and also can lend us money at quite short notice when we purchase properties in auctions and so on. We also have grants. In Hull, we have right to buy replacement grant from the council, which that only applies in some local authority areas where they're still selling council houses. And as you can see, some of the usual trust and grant givers there. The one at the bottom is interesting. It's not something we've used yet, but it might be something we'll be looking to do in the future, which is prudential borrowing. At the moment, potentially you can be borrowing money off your local authorities for like 1% over 30 or even 50 years, which again goes back to that relationship with the local authority. And just a quick look at the costs here. I mean, I appreciate that you probably aren't buying houses for £38,000 in Wales, although maybe there are places where that's sort of pricing available. I'm not sure, but you can see roughly the money we're spending there. And then at the bottom, just a little mortgage calculator for how much that costs if you borrow all of that money. So it's very sustainable. It's very cost effective. I don't think these numbers will look the same for our new build. And just quickly, just not a warning, but just some things to remember in housing management. All these things on the list we've had to deal with at some point. I mean, we have lots of pictures and lots of stories of people we've helped out of all sorts of housing crises, but things do go wrong. And here's just a list of some of the first things that came into our head of things that can go wrong. And some of these are quite challenging situations to have to deal with. And hoarding seems to be becoming an increasingly common one of them. As well as houses, we also acquire the odd other empty building. We bought this one for £1. but not really much time to talk about that now. And through our Empty Homes work, we're able to set up other projects. We have a gardening project, we have a bike project, restoring and reusing old bikes. Quickly, just to finish on with the houses we're building. So we're using a timber build system, modern version of Water Seagull. Duncan, the architect, in the centre of the photo, used to teach at CATS down the road from you guys. This is the start of the build, and this is where we were up to last week. So these are 3 houses, super insulated, solar thermal, solar PV. But it's not going to be cheap, and it's taken a long time, which brings me back to my first point around how effective empty homes work can be. That's it for me. Thank you, Alan, and sorry for running over by 4 minutes and 21 seconds.
That's absolutely fine, Martin. And it was a much welcome overrun because it's so inspiring to see the work that you've been doing there. I was a student at Hull back in the 90s, so it's really nice to revisit some of those places in photo form and see the changes that you've made. And I'm getting lots of positive comments in the chat as well from people saying very inspiring and incredible what you're doing there. I don't know if anybody has any questions at this point for Martin. You could just unmute yourself if you want. There's none in the chat, I don't think, at the moment. But if anybody wants to do that now, then please do and ask the question, and then I will arrange a quick 10-minute breakout room for chats.
Nope.
Feels like not at the moment. Catherine is waving at me. Thanks, Catherine.
Sorry, we're just about to hopefully start our community housing project in Abu Dhabi, which is a tiny little village, which is 60% holiday homes. And there's not many locals to get involved in the project. I was just wondering how many people actually started your project. How many people in your core group?
Well, it's a long time ago. If my memory serves me right, there was probably a core group of probably sort of about 14 people, 15 people. But that group evaporated down to about 3 or 4 when we actually bought a house and started working on it. But I think there was a core group of people, and they were people that did know each other, that were kind of quite well connected. So I think that really helped, I would say. But yes, we were also fully committed to it, and I think trying to do this thing in like the evenings or as a kind of hobby or on top of a full-time job can be quite tricky. Because there wasn't really a lot of jobs around in the 80s, we were just happy to sling ourselves into it. So most of us were actually unemployed when we set the thing up.
Okay. And how long from setting up to actually housing your first person do you think it might have been?
It was actually pretty quick because we had various just sort of I mean, we had people going. I mean, the first 3 or 4 houses were bought in individuals' names. I mean, this is a long time ago now, so all the hopefully, please stop looking for me now. But there was people going out and getting mortgages in their name and stuff like that. I mean, they were throwing mortgages at people back in the mid-80s. So we actually had properties. We actually got 4 properties very quickly, all in individuals' names. And because we weren't particularly capable of, we weren't builders in any sense when we did that, we were just sort of painting them up and got them let out. So that did actually happen pretty quickly, but that's, you know, as I say, how we did that was how we did it. And then those 4 houses got put into the what was then a cooperative when we set it up in the cooperative name a couple of years later. But it's relatively straightforward. You can buy a house. We bought a house in 2 weeks before in terms of conveyancing, especially if you buy them at an auction, which probably isn't the best place to start. But you know, that is, I'm not wishing to sound like a stuck record, but you can buy a house reasonably in sort of 5 to 6 weeks of conveyancing, and you can renovate it in 12 weeks. So you can go from, and my argument is with new build, that's never going to happen. I mean, I'm aware of new build groups that have been going 10 years and haven't got any land yet. workshops and meetings, and it's tough to do the new build route. And I think this is just a good kind of entry level way of doing it.
Great, thank you.
That's great, thank you. Okay, I think we'll go into breakout rooms now, if that's okay with everybody. And it's just as an opportunity really to think and talk about what we just heard, and then to those questions that I asked at the beginning, which is how we could, sorry, I'll just refer back to them. What can we do now to bring more empty homes into use, and what needs to change to make it easier? So I will open all rooms. It's about 10 minutes, this, and then you'll come back into the main room. If anybody in any of the rooms has a problem, just you can drop me as the host a message from the room. Okay, great, thank you. Great. I think, oh, there's still some more people coming back into the room. I hope you had a lively discussion. I'm sure you did. They're pretty lively each month. We haven't got very long left, unfortunately, because we should all finish by past. I'm sure you've got lunches to have and other meetings and things to do. But there was a question outstanding for Martin around the subject of churches, which maybe if Martin's in the room. Yes, he is. Great. Then, my video is not started. Yes, somebody's asking me to stop the video. Sorry about that. Yeah, so there's a question around churches and whether you would like to say something about that, Martin.
Well, I'm conscious that a Welsh chapel might be a slightly sort of a more straightforward project than what we've taken on there. I mean, we've taken that on because it's a big empty building in the middle of our neighbourhood that was probably going to end up being demolished. It's got loads of people's memories and history in it. It's got war memorials in it and everything. So we're going to try and do something with it, but it's going to, you know, we're going to put a 15-year plan in place and take our time. We've managed to get a bit of ERDF, European money, to do some building work in there, but we're not making it residential. We're going to make it into community space and some business office space and not fundamentally tamper too much with the structure. But I'm conscious that a lot of your Welsh chapels convert very nicely into houses and residential spaces. I don't know if that's what you were thinking, Rosemary.
Thanks very much. Depending on the site, probably both.
I know people have put in a residential proposal for that church we showed a slide of, but the church, as in the organisation, weren't interested in that. So in the end, once we'd proved our credentials, they sold it to us for £1. So, which I think
we'd probably only be interested if we could find somewhere else for £1, but the church in Wales isn't very keen on selling for that amount of money.
Well, I think we were ripped off because I think it's actually a massive liability. So, you know, they probably should have given us it and strapped a couple of 100,000 to it. But so, yeah, things for £1 aren't always good, necessarily good value.
That's great. Thank you.
On that subject, I've put a link in the chat to the Architectural Heritage Fund. We did hope to have a speaker from AHF here today, but they're very busy processing claims before the end of the financial year. So, but they will come along to another event later on and talk you through what might be available in terms of grants from the Architectural Heritage Fund, particularly related to Wales, but the fund obviously exists across the UK. And I've put in the link in the chat, sorry, the couple of links to the events that are going on next week, the Rural Housing Summit in Scotland and the Housing Lynn event. So feel free to click on those. I don't know if anybody has any closing remarks they'd like to add before we all pop off. Matt has put his hand up. You're on mute, Matt.
I was thrilled to hear in my breakout group from Angela Vincent that the Empty Homes Network is producing a toolkit to assist authorities, well, everybody, but authorities and communities to bring empty homes into use, and I really look forward to seeing that. And just wonder if Alan, you might be able to, or Angela might somehow be able to share it with the group. When it comes out, maybe a link or something.
Well, I think there's going to be a big campaign around it. I just got an email actually because I was on the steering group for that. Yeah, it's going to come out in May. There's going to be lots of training events and a big splash about it. So I think it will be out there.
Brilliant, thanks, Angela. Catherine has her hand up.
Just super quick, Arvon, who is in our group, who used to be, I believe, the rural housing enabler for Meirionnydd, made a really interesting point that local authorities have an empty homes officer, and if you create a relationship with them and ask them to send letters to the listed empty home owners, that's one way of identifying it, and that gets around the privacy thing, because it's not you trying to get the information yourself, but you can actually ask the empty homes officer to do it on your behalf, which I thought was really interesting.
Great, thanks, Catherine. So I think that's us for today. Thank you all so much for coming along and taking part. It's been a really interesting session, and thanks in particular to our speakers. All had so many interesting things to say, and I know we could have talked about this for much longer, but maybe, I mean, there were some requests for some kind of practical sessions in last month's network meeting, so maybe we'll come back to this at some point with a bigger thing just around retrofitting and empty homes. But yeah, something to carry on the conversation with as another point. Just to say, we'll be back again next month with another network meeting. I can't remember off the top of my head what the date is. Claire, can you remember? And but you can we will mail everybody anyway that date and what we'll be talking about then, and yeah, you'll get to hear about that, I'm sure. Brilliant, thank you everybody. Diolch yn fawr, and see you next time, and have a great month.
Diolch yn fawr.
Take care.
Thank you everyone for organising.